in the way beginning, I would say I heard about composting, but I really thought it was this like hippie, scary, rolling in the dirt kind of thing. And I'm a clean freak. I love being outside, but I need to stay clean. And I just thought composting was way too scary.
Hi, guys, and welcome back. Today we are talking with Rebecca Schwartz all about composting. I know. It is a large and often confusing topic for many people. So the purpose of today's episode is to hopefully break it down piece by piece. So that way you can better understand things like what is composting, how do you compost, are there different types of composting, and also the difference between the terms compostable versus biodegradable. Rebecca is on social media under @Robex, where she shares her easy tips for living more eco-friendly, and also has a master's in sustainability management from Columbia. I learned so much in today's episode, and I know you will too. Heads up that my mic was actually recording through my computer and not my actual microphone for like the first maybe 10 minutes of this episode. So sorry about that quality, but it gets better right around like the 8 to 10 minute mark. So forgive me for that. No one's perfect. Anyways, let's get into today's topic.
Hey, Rebecca. Welcome to the podcast.
I am so excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm so excited to have you on. We're going to be talking all things composting, all the nuanced questions that I feel like falls under composting. But before we hop into it, let's start with this week's favorites. I have one. Do you want to go ahead and go first?
Sure. I have a very special one, which was that my husband and I have been planning a camper van trip for over a year, and we finally got to take it, and we went all around Colorado, and it was just so incredible to be that close to nature, and that is definitely one of my favorites. I would say the second is that I also got to spend a lot of time with my family last week, right next to a farm that sells all their produce. And it was incredible just to get to eat all the delicious, like we could see the farm from where we had our breakfast, and it was perfect. So those are definitely my two favorites.
Oh my gosh, that's amazing. Okay, first of all, a camper van trip. How long were you in a van? Were you sleeping there too?
Yeah, we were only able to go for 5 days, but it was perfect. It was a great like introduction to camper van life or van life. And so, yeah, we slept in the van. We had a kitchen, we had a shower, we had a toilet. I have like a van tour up on my socials, and we both just loved it so much. And we definitely would love to do another camper van trip. It was so perfect for us.
I love that. So you would do it again?
For sure. There's definitely a lot that I learned from it of how to better prepare moving forward, like to do it again. But it was better than I even imagined. And I would 1000% do it again. And if we could find the time, we would love to do it for like a week or 2 weeks, even 5 days just wasn't enough.
I love that. I love it so much. Did you travel around, or did you kind of pick one spot and stay in it?
Yeah, so we were in Colorado. My husband he loves to drive, so he really wanted to see a bunch. So we actually saw 3 national parks in 5 days, which were Rocky Mountain, the Black Canyon of the Gunnison, and also the Great Sand Dunes. And it was so incredible to just see all the different nature in one state. And it really got me thinking a lot about how states and like the borders that we have today are just so arbitrary. And like, I was thinking like, wow, it's so crazy that we drove 2 hours south in one state and we went from green forest to sand dunes. And then I kind of had to remember like the state boundaries that we think of and know are man-made. And like, is it really that crazy that there's another state that's all desert right below it, So it was just an interesting thing to think about as we moved through the state.
Yeah, super interesting concept. I'm not sure I've ever thought about it in that way, but now that you mention it, like that's just crazy that there's so many different landscapes within different states, and it makes you feel like you're in a totally different place, but you're still in the same space because it's man-made state lines. It's pretty crazy.
What was your favorite?
My favorite is I only have one this week. And I went to Dallas and visited some of my friends from college. And while we were there, one of my friends was like, I want to get a permanent bracelet. And I was like, okay, like let's get matching ones. And so I have a permanent bracelet now, which I thought that it was going to be kind of annoying because you can't take it off. And normally I'm weird with my jewelry, but I guess because the chain is like, it's literally so small, like you can't even really feel that it's on your wrist at all whatsoever. But it's been like super cool. And I like that because when I buy jewelry, like I want something I'm going to pretty much wear every single day. I've never really been the kind of person to like buy like a bunch of different earrings and a bunch of different necklaces. I really have like my staples and I stick to them. And I feel like the permanent bracelet has been like such a fun little thing to just have on my wrist. Now it's only been a few days, so I might change this opinion in like a week and be like, I hate it. Like it's so annoying. But as of right now, I'm loving it.
Yeah, it looks so nice. Like it's like small and dainty and just simple, but it adds like a little bit of like accessorizing. I also never change my jewelry. The only time I'll ever change something is maybe I'll change my earrings for a wedding. Mm-hmm. But also I no longer, like if something's going to tarnish in water, like I just don't, because I don't take off anything for the shower. Mm-hmm. I don't take off anything to go swimming, just maybe swapping my earrings for a wedding. And so I think my sister has one of those permanent bracelets and I've thought about it. So I'll wait to see how you feel in a week and maybe then I'll dive in.
Yeah. Oh, I'll let you know. Okay. I'm ready to talk about composting. Do you want to hop into it?
I'm always ready to talk about composting. Oh. I would love to.
Rebecca, if you could please introduce yourself to everybody, your journey with composting and sustainability, that would be amazing.
Yes, definitely. So my sustainability journey really started in undergrad from social media when everyone started talking about not using single-use straws to save the turtles. Everyone had really strong opinions on it. Some people hated it. Some people thought it was the most important thing in the world. And I sort of thought, like, I don't know that this is really going to make that big of a difference, but I can easily not use a straw if that's going to potentially help someone or an animal. And I always say that single-use straws and that whole save the straw debacle really was like my gateway drug into sustainability, because then from there, it was just everything. I kept learning more and more, and I just couldn't stop. So that's really, once I started learning, I also realized that a lot of my friends and peers just didn't know any of the things that I was now learning about. And I thought, this could help a lot of people. So I started sharing it on social media, and I felt like this is how I started. So I would love to share it in the same way. And then my personal sustainability journey continued to grow. I was working a corporate 9-to-5, and I found a sustainability master's at the Columbia Climate School, which really combined sustainability in business and really how businesses can incorporate this from a for-profit perspective. And I just thought that was a perfect program for me. So I got my master's at Columbia, and basically throughout that and ever since, I've now been really sharing everything that I know on social media and trying to bring more people into the conversation. Throughout my sustainability journey, in the way beginning, I would say I heard about composting, but I really thought it was this like hippie, scary, rolling in the dirt kind of thing. And I'm a clean freak. I love being outside, but I need to stay clean. And I just thought composting was way too scary. And then as I continued my composting journey, and we'll get into what is composting and why it's so important. So I don't want to give any spoilers yet, but I learned just how important it was and also how easy it was, and that it actually doesn't require you to roll around in dirt ever. So I started giving it a shot in my small New York City apartment. I now have convinced my parents to start composting in their house. And I'm also, I love composting, as you can probably tell, and you'll continue to hear over the next 45 minutes, but I am also building a composting masterclass so that everybody can understand what composting is, why it's so important, and really just how literally everybody can compost. And we'll get into that in the rest of the episode. But that's a little bit about me. And I'm just so excited to be here.
Oh my gosh, I love that. Thank you for sharing everything. And I agree with you. Composting seems like this really like big, like daunting thing, especially for somebody who like doesn't really know the ins and outs of it all. It does sound very like hippie-ish, rolling in the dirt. So I'm super excited to talk more about that. Can you please explain like what is composting?
Yeah, definitely. So I won't be able to give you the technical definition, but composting is basically the breaking down of natural products back into our environment. So it's a naturally circular process of using the earth and everything in the earth that we have already to break down things that come from the earth already. So natural matter, whether it's produce or leaves or cuttings from your grass or even brown paper bags, which we can get into that. But really, the reason why composting is so important is because when those items like your apple core, that you didn't finish, when we just send them in our regular trash and they end up in a landfill due to the lack of oxygen, the breakdown process that it actually has creates methane, which is one of the 3 most common greenhouse gases. And methane is actually 25 times more potent than carbon. So we talk a lot about avoiding all these carbon emissions, and we're not really talking so much about methane. So every time we're throwing our vegetable scraps or our leftover food that has gone bad into our regular trash and it ends up in a landfill, as it breaks down, we are emitting methane into the atmosphere. And by simply separating it out and letting it break down on its own with more oxygen and water and everything like that, we avoid that creation of methane to then be emitted into our atmosphere. So we are helping avoid a very potent greenhouse gas from ending up in our atmosphere just by simply separating it out.
Interesting. Yeah, there's so much to that I don't think a lot of people realize, that it's not just about your food scraps. It's about really the methane gas that can really contribute to climate change.
Yeah, I didn't realize this. Like, I didn't really understand why. I thought it was because composting makes a soil. So I thought it was only if you really wanted the soil for a garden. And I was like, okay, I don't have a garden yet. Like, it's not really relevant to me. And I never really understood why anyone would need to do it if you didn't need the soil. But as I learned more about it, it's really one of the largest things that an individual can do to lower emissions in our society. And it's growing in popularity, and in different places and municipalities that are offering it, that it's becoming easier and easier to do. And it really is just training yourself the same way you train yourself to put certain things in a recycling bin. It's just training yourself to put things in, a different small bin. But I think I didn't realize it. So I'm sure there are other people who didn't realize it either, that just how much of an impact composting can really have. Even if you don't garden at all, you don't need the soil, it still is so impactful on our environment.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I know that there are some different types of composting, right? So you're saying that this is the compost. I guess this is a home compost, right?
Yeah.
Did I get that?
Yeah.
That there's another type that's, I guess, commercial composting. Like, I'm picturing when I am out and I see like it looks like plastic, but then it's like got this green lettering on the side of the cup and it says compostable in a commercial composting facility. Do you know the difference between those two different types?
Yeah, definitely. So I think this is like another thing that people mix up: home versus industrial or commercial composting. Those are interchangeable phrases. And then we'll also get into how people throw biodegradability into that. And that's something else totally separate. So the difference between home compost and industrial compost is basically just the size of the machinery. So when you're doing it at home, you basically just have either like a tumbler, which is like a bin that can move, like you can rotate it so that the produce can move through it, or you can do it on your own with like a pitchfork or whatever, which is just more physically. I have a tumbler because I'm not strong enough, or I don't want to do that. But you could do it with really any bin at home. And basically that's just, there's no, machinery. There's nothing that's really helping, break down anything too complicated. So it takes a little bit longer depending on, what you have in there. But it's also just manpower. So industrial composting is on a much larger scale, and they have machinery to help it process faster, move faster, like you can move large bundles at a time.
Mm-hmm.
And so what you're referring to about the cups, those are typically bioplastics, meaning a plastic-like substance that's made from something that's natural from the earth, whether it's like corn starch or whatever. And typically those items can only be broken down in an industrial compost. But this is something that I'm extremely passionate about, because I think more and more companies that are incredibly making more compostable materials and products, we need to push them to continue to grow in having that differentiation on their packaging, so that as people learn more about composting and it gets more and more popular, that on a product, you're really able to understand, okay, this can't go in my home compost, but it has to go in an industrial one.
Mm-hmm.
Because without that clarification, we can end up with people putting it in a home compost and it's not going to break down, and just then it's going to cause chaos, basically. So we need to make sure that we're encouraging companies that are making compostable products to make it clear whether it's home compostable or industrial.
So if you do have something that isn't industrial composting, it needs to go to like the commercial facility to be composted properly. How do you get it there? Like if you throw it in your regular trash can, is that the same thing? Or does your city, or like for us, we have a green bin. And so that goes to our city and it goes to a commercial thing. You can put like tree branches in there and then they'll sort it all out. And then you can go pick up free mulch from the city. Same thing with compost, all that stuff. So that's kind of where all of our stuff goes. But if somebody doesn't actively have a green bin, or they live in an apartment, how do you get it from point A to point B?
I did a little bit of research on this because I live near New York City, and in New York City, there's a lot of really great resources through the Department of Sanitation, so dsny.com. But I know you're in Texas, and obviously people are listening from all over. And so it's really important that you basically just Google from where you are. So my parents live in Connecticut, and I Googled for them like composting in Stamford, or, my friends who live in other states, I've Googled for them and done the research. But there is one map that I found that kind of has a map of the US, but it's really in terms of showing where there's composting all across. But I would recommend for your specific city to just Google like in compost near me or drop off near me.
Okay.
If you're doing it at home, you could do it in your backyard and you don't need to drop it off anywhere. But if you don't want to do the composting yourself and drop it off somewhere, or you have something that needs to be industrially composted, I would, unfortunately, right now, the only way to really find out is to Google it and to find out, like you were explaining, how your city really handles it.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing that I think is really important is the transparency in the different composting that's available. So in New York City, for example, they're now putting compost bins on street corners the same way that they have trash bins, which is amazing. And that is going to the city composting, which is industrial. In addition, all the farmers markets in New York City also have a compost drop-off. So I used to live right near one of those farmers markets, and it was amazing. However, the ones at the farmers market is basically a large-scale home compost versus the ones on the street is an industrial compost. So that's just a way that I'm trying to highlight that it can be a little confusing, and it's just very important to Google before you put it in to understand what your city is doing and what is the best way to approach it with your city. Because unfortunately, there's no standardization across different cities and states. And I can share more about New York City, but I know that won't apply to everyone.
Yeah, that reminds me of San Francisco. I was back there in July of this summer, and the same way as New York City, it sounds like, where when you see a recycling bin and a trash bin, there's always a third one for compost. And I assume that goes to a commercial composting facility. And most places have now adopted like choosing those compostable plastics, bioplastics that need the industrial facility versus like traditional plastic that has to go into the trash can or the recycling bin. And I find that so fascinating. And I love that New York City is doing that now too, because I feel like that means that it's becoming more widely available for people, especially in these cities that have like millions of people walking around. And that can make such a difference in the grand scheme of things. So amazing.
Totally. In New York City alone, 35% of the waste is compostable. So what is like 35% of what is going just through the trash and going to the landfill can be composted. And so imagine if we could, even just take half of that and actually compost it, of how much methane reduction we would have. And in New York City, they have these really cool automated bins, which are the ones that the city's putting out on the street. And on the side of it, it actually tells you what you can and can't put in. So that's a little bit helpful in terms of education. But it does require a little bit, it's similar to recycling, right? Like in every place that you go or where you live, you have to look up your local recycling laws. Like, can you recycle a pizza box with oil in it already, like oil stains? That's different everywhere. And so this is similar. And so if this is something you want to get started with, first of all, I'm always here to answer any questions. I love helping anyone start with their composting journey, but it's best to just Google Stanford composting and then kind of just try and find out, is it home compostable or is it a large scale industrial one, and kind of what they can and can't take.
Okay. I love that. Thank you. I feel like that's super helpful for anybody listening that wants to know more of the nuance behind it, because it is new. Like, it reminds me of recycling. When recycling was first introduced to everyone, it wasn't to the same scale that it is today, right? Like, not everybody had a recycling bin in their homes and their apartment complexes where they were able to just like easily utilize what they had. Like, there was some learning to it. And I feel like that's kind of the stage that we're at with composting right now. And I hope that in the next like 5-10 years, it becomes where everybody does it and it's just like very normal for everyone to do. But you're right. There is kind of that education piece that people have to learn. Now, I want to play a little bit of like devil's advocate here. Kind of. Well, mostly just because I want to know like your thoughts on this. So like for me, like if I'm in the store and I can pick between like a traditional, like, I don't know, plastic red Solo cup versus like the biodegradable or the what do you call them? Bioplastics made out of like corn that are commercially compostable. Normally, like I'll go ahead and I will pick up the compostable ones versus the red plastic ones because I know that they're better. But like if I'm going to a friend's house and maybe they're not on the same page as me, and maybe I had to leave early so I can't like bring them home. Like, I would say for most people, that's quite a lot of work. And I don't know if everybody has the same willingness to do that to the degree that like you or me would. So if somebody's selecting these commercially compostable plastics and they still make it up in the trash, is that still better than going for plastic? Would you say, in your opinion?
Yeah, so this is a very complicated question.
Okay.
And there's a lot of kind of different ways that it can go depending on different circumstances. So bioplastic, there's been some research done on bioplastic, and it's, a term that encompasses any kind of plastic and there's a lot of different types. So, and I don't know specifically the nuanced difference between them, but I have seen research done, which is basically saying that a lot of the bioplastics aren't really fully breaking down, even in an industrial composting site, and that they're creating basically a biomicroplastic, and that they're not really adding the same nutrients that the compost can have on its own. So you're presenting a very hard situation, right? You're picking between typical red Solo cups or a bioplastic one. And you touched on kind of what happens if a bioplastic cup goes to the trash. My understanding is that bioplastic, whether it's in a landfill or my understanding is that a bioplastic item maybe wouldn't be producing the methane, but rather what you're doing is using a natural resource as opposed to plastic that is typically coming from fossil fuels. So that's kind of what you're getting at in terms of the added benefit. But I think a bioplastic cup that ends up in a landfill would not break down at all. And so if the two cups are going to end up in the same place, let's say they both are going to end up in the trash, right? You're confident that your friend is going to put both of them in the trash. I think that I would think about it from the perspective of like what resources were taken to build this product, because they're going to end up in the same place anyways. So I think the bioplastic would probably still be better because you're avoiding the fossil fuels in creating that. But I don't think that the actual breakdown of the cups would be any different. I think the bioplastic would probably break down a lot faster than the regular plastic, but that it's intended to end up in a composting facility. So there's just a lot of nuance and it gets a little bit complicated. And the way that I like to kind of take a step back with some of these things to avoid all of that confusion, if you have two items, the traditional item and then something that's, quote, more eco-friendly or more sustainable, if the two items are truly a one-to-one swap, meaning you don't have to change any of your habits to actually use and dispose of the, quote, more eco-friendly item, I hold the opinion that it's really not going to be that big of a difference.
Okay.
But whether it's a industrial compost cup or a home compost material, both of those things require us to change our habits and to divert it, instead of putting it in the trash, putting it in the compost and figure out, a drop-off system of that compost. But if you are taking those two items and nothing has to change, you drink from it the same way, you do everything the exact same way, and then you just throw it in the trash, it's probably not that big of a difference. Mm-hmm. And so that isn't to discourage anyone or to say that we need to make all these changes. But I think it's an easy way to think about these swaps, because as someone who started with all of these different swaps, you can so quickly get in over your head. And then you lose yourself in, well, what is really better? Like, am I really making the right choice? And I've learned from experience, going down that rabbit hole doesn't help anyone. You get lost, you get eco-anxiety, there's burnout, and you end up not really being able to be that impactful. So I think if you just think about it, taking a step back and think about what it really has to happen, that's an easy way to think about, is this really going to make that much of a difference?
Yeah, I love that. And I like how it's just realistic, right? Like, this is the reality of what it is. When you look at it big picture, when you compare a traditional plastic to a bioplastic that is commercially compostable, if you're not actually changing what you're doing with it, it's still going to a landfill at the end of the day. While, yes, it does take different resources, so there's something to say there, but it's not actually breaking down in the same way. I feel like it allows people to understand that there's a life after you throw it away, right? So if the future of it goes to a landfill, it's still going to be on this planet long after, we're not. But if you do the right thing and you put it in a separate container, or if you put it in the green bin, if you put it where it belongs to go to a commercial compost, then you're actually creating more of the circular cycle that it should have, that it was intended to have when it was created. And I feel like that's a way for people to understand that their actions really do have consequences. So you kind of have to change the action, even though it may be hard to remember at first.
Yeah, definitely. And I think another way to think about how that action that might seem seemingly small for an individual, I think, especially if you live in a smaller city like Stamford, where my parents live, that they're only now really in the past year or two building out their composting facility, right? And their options for locals to use it and drop it off. And if they see that locals are dropping more off and using it more and more, that's how the government understands that resources need more funding, right? The more people use the library, the more they want to support the library. But when they have a decline in membership, then the government starts to question the value of things. So if you're an individual that's using a government resource over and over again, you're also sending a message to the government, this is important and this is what I want. And so even if you think your individual compost isn't going to do much, that's another message that you're sending that is super important.
I love that. I love that so much. It reminds me of we had an episode probably a few months ago at this point where the big takeaway was just use your community resources, because it gives the signal that they're needed and people like using them. So if you don't go to your community parks, if you don't go to your community libraries, eventually the funding won't go to those anymore. So you have to show people that they're wanted and they're needed in the community. And I feel like this is kind of the same thing. I love that so much. Okay, so we've really talked about commercial composting. We've touched on a little bit of home composting. Commercial composting is complicated. It's a little nuanced. I feel like that's kind of what we're getting at here. But home composting is a little bit different, right? That's something that is not as nuanced at all. Can you talk more about how you can do composting at home?
Yeah. And I think people typically associate home composting with having a big backyard, needing the soil, wanting to get dirty, and understanding exactly what it takes to create the perfect compost pile. And people typically think, hey, I live in an apartment, I can't compost. I would argue composting in an apartment is far easier than composting when you live in a house. Because when you live in an apartment, people typically think that when we say that we're composting, that you're talking about the whole cycle of taking the produce, putting it in the bin, making all the soil, and having the end result. But composting really can also be synonymous to the process of recycling. You're not the actual one recycling the plastic, but rather you're putting it in the appropriate place to make sure the company can get it and appropriately recycle it. You're not in charge of recycling the plastic. So similarly, when you live in an apartment and you don't have outdoor space, or you don't have that much outdoor space, or frankly, if you just live in a house and you just don't really want to deal with it because you don't want to touch any of it and you don't need the soil, dropping off, or now there are different pickup systems, again, depending on where you live. Some are private, some are public. So I don't want to give anyone misinformation for where you live, but just collecting your compost and dropping it off or having it picked up is far simpler than actually making the compost yourself. And so when I was living in an apartment, it was so easy. I put it in my bin. I put it in my personal compost bin on my countertop, and then I just dropped it off and I didn't have to deal with it. Versus now I'm with my parents and I'm helping them get their compost set up. They have a backyard and we're doing the whole tumbler bin, and it's far more complicated. So I think apartment composting is far easier. And basically, the things that can go in any apartment or any home compost, whether it's industrial, home, everything, are anything that came from the earth. So fruits, vegetables, herbs, carton egg crates, hair, coffee grounds, toenails, not in the kitchen, but that comes from the bathroom. And then brown paper bags. So those are the things that you can always put in your compost. And when you're doing it at home and dropping it off, you don't have to worry about the compilation of exactly how much stuff you have. And it's very, very easy.
Okay. So your recommendation would be, like, first of all, composting is for anyone, no matter where you live. And then if you're in an apartment, or honestly in a house, and maybe you don't have a garden, you don't need the soil for whatever reason, you don't have to do every step to get it to be actual soil, but just doing the separation of your food scraps. Hair, you mentioned hair. Okay.
Yeah.
I would assume pet fur would fall into that as well. Hair,
Yes.
So taking those items and then doing a simple drop off, or if you have a green bin, like I said, I mentioned I have a green bin, so I just throw it in there. But if you have either that or a drop off that you can go to, like farmer's market, that's probably like the easiest way to start composting without having to do all the nuanced portion of making sure you have the right ratio of this to that to actually get it to be soil.
Right. Literally everybody can compost. And people frequently think that composting requires all these extra steps. When I say I compost, all I mean is that I am separating my food scraps, ensuring they're ending up in a separate bin so that they can be put in a place where they can be composted, whether it's at my home or by the state, and ensure that no methane is being created and emitted from the breaking down of the natural produce. So literally everybody can compost. It is so easy. And if you live in an apartment, it is the easiest that it can be.
I love that. I love that so much, because I do feel like when I think about my socials, and I think about people are always wanting advice for living in a dorm, living in an apartment, or even living with like roommates and stuff. I feel like those are all things that I commonly get asked. And when it comes to composting, I feel like in the past I've been like, I don't really know, because I'm picturing it from your food scrap to actual soil. But the way you phrase it makes it so much easier to do, like way easier. It's just a slight behavior change. Making sure
exactly
you're separating it and dropping it off where it belongs.
Exactly. And in cities now with expanding resources are making it easier than ever. And depending on your level of access or how much you want to put into it, when I was living on the Upper East Side in Manhattan, I paid $10 a month to have somebody come and pick it up. And, it made it so easy for me. I didn't have to think about it. I just put it outside the apartment. It got picked up. I got a clean bin. And every month they would send me just how much I had composted on my own, and they would kind of give me the equivalence of like how many cars would like how many miles a car would have driven to get to the same amount of emissions, and just different equivalents that really made it easy for me to wrap my head around and understand the impact. So that's another option. You could find a pickup in your area, or you can do it yourself. Like, there's so many options, but really the simplest way is just to Google compost near me, start separating your food scraps, and then put it in a separate bin. And if you are nervous about the smell, which is everyone's first concern, first of all, it doesn't really smell. But if you're very nervous about it, then put it in your freezer. I love keeping a container of my food scraps, which I also make into vegetable stock. And once I've made the vegetable stock, I put the food scraps back in that container, keep it in my freezer. And then when I'm ready to compost it, I take it right out. And the freezer obviously freezes them in their current state, not allowing them to break down at all, meaning there's no smell. So then I just take it directly from the freezer to my drop-off point. I do that now because my parents have asked me to do that. When I was living on my own, I had my own bin on my countertop. That's how I like to do it. But my parents have asked that it stays in the freezer. So whether you're living alone, whether you're living with a partner who doesn't get it, roommates, parents, there's a lot of hurdles that can happen. And there are ways to go around them. And so one way is, keeping it in the freezer, and then you avoid any of the smell or any of the potential mess that you think may happen.
That is great advice, because the smell is something. I have one that sits on my countertop, and we have a carbon filter on the top of it. So the smell is not really something I've ever experienced. But if it is something like, if you're very sensitive to smells and you're worried about it, the freezer's a great idea. I've never even thought about it that way. Okay. You mentioned biodegradable, and I want to talk about that a little bit. So I have seen products when I'm in the grocery store, and it will say like made of biodegradable ingredients, materials, biodegradable plastic, whatever it is. But then sometimes I'll see it and it says made with compostable or can be commercially composted. So what is the difference between biodegradable versus compostable? Because I do feel like those are very similar. They have similar auras, if you will.
Yeah, definitely. And people always use them interchangeably. So I think it's definitely important to explain the difference between the two. So biodegradable, basically, like when you break down the word, it basically just means that something will break down naturally. So the reason why I have such an issue with the term biodegradable is, at least in America, there's no regulation around the term. And so there's no time frame of how long something takes to break down in order for it to be biodegradable. So my favorite example is your Poland Spring water bottle. That's biodegradable. However, it'll take 1,000 years to break down. And when it does, it'll leave behind a lot of toxic and harmful microplastics in whatever environment that it's in. Versus, in order for something to be compostable, it has to do with the amount of oxygen that it needs to break down. And there's a specific amount of temperature and circumstances that need to be met in order for that material to break down. In order for someone to claim that something is compostable, there has to be some sort of testing and measurement to understand how this is going to break down. Is it home compostable? Is it industrially compostable? There is a lot of research and testing that's done behind the scenes in order to ensure that something is actually compostable, and it's a specific environment that's required. Versus biodegradable, there are products that are biodegradable that would take, let's say they test them and they know they're going to take 90 days to biodegrade. And because of the specific substance, it doesn't need the compost environment to actually break down. So I have no problem with that if a brand says this is biodegradable within 90 days, 160 days, within a year, whatever it is. But typically when we see biodegradable, it doesn't specify any time frame at all. It's more about the lack of transparency and details around the term, and being biodegradable on its own doesn't really mean anything, because almost everything is biodegradable if you give it enough time.
Yeah, that makes total sense. It's really interesting to think about. So I guess if you were looking at a product and all it had was biodegradable, or a different product right next to it said compostable, no time frame, no nothing, which one would you pick? Probably the compostable?
Yes, definitely. I would definitely pick the compostable one. And if it doesn't specify, I would either look into it or I would just try to bring it to an industrial compost just to save myself the time of doing the research. But I would
Mhm.
always pick compostable over biodegradable, because assuming there's no time frame, because if something's compostable and I put it in a compost bin, I know that it's going to break down in the amount of time that everything else breaks down. And the composting time frame has less to do with the product and more to do with the environment that it's in and the machinery. And, so I know for sure that it'll break down if something's compostable versus biodegradable. There's nothing I can do to control and to ensure that this thing will break down. And I have
Mm.
no idea if I'm sending it to a landfill for it to break down in 90 days or 1,000 years. And obviously, that's a very big difference.
Yeah, that is a very big difference. Okay, well, then let me give you another scenario. Like, what would you pick between something that said biodegradable in 90 days versus commercially compostable? Which of those are those around the same for you?
I think, yeah, I would say I think it depends on the product, because the other element of biodegradable is you have to think about where the item is biodegrading.
Mm.
So even if something would biodegrade in 90 days, it still would be probably biodegrading in a landfill. And as much as possible, I want to avoid sending things to landfills, versus composting. The other element of composting that we haven't really touched on is composting is a fully circular process, and there is an end result of the soil that we touched on before that is a really valuable thing for our environment. So that nutrient dense soil that comes from composting is an incredible resource. It builds another economy for people to, buy and sell. So I would still probably choose composting, because something that's biodegrading, even if it has the time frame, I would need to know the time frame. I would need to know the circumstances in which it can break down and also what gets left behind when it breaks down. So that's a lot of information to get, versus I know with something that's being composted, especially in an industrial facility, to ensure it's being composted, there's also an end result that's really valuable, which is that nutrient dense soil that can help us with more nutrient dense produce, or for people to have gardens. Like you said, you could pick up compost in your local town. So I would want to support that. But if you see a product that is biodegradable and it gives you a time frame, that's very impressive, because it's very rare that you'll find that.
Okay, interesting. So it sounds like picking compostable and making sure it ends up where it needs to go, whether it's an industrial site or if it's your home compost or a drop-off compost, whatever it might be, it's definitely the better route, because it contributes to more of the circularity behind things, that it can go back to growing new plants to then provide for other things, versus biodegradable is not it. We don't really know, like, yes, it breaks down, but if it's in a landfill, it's not actually doing anything afterwards. Did I get that right?
Exactly. Yeah. We love circularity.
Yeah, we love circularity. Okay, question for you. Again, just because I feel like I'm learning so much with this, because there's just so much to it and I love it so much. So another thing that I see biodegradable on are commonly like cleaning products, like the ingredients inside of the bottle are biodegradable. What's your thought on that? Is there any substance behind that? Because for me, I'm like, if it's cleaning, is it really like safe to biodegrade? I don't know. I don't really know what my thoughts are on there, but I want to know your thoughts if you have any.
Yeah, so I just found, like, in my parents' house, this camp soap. The bottle doesn't have a brand. I don't know how old it is because my parents keep things for so long, but it just on it says camp soap. And then below it, it says biodegradable. And it's just like a plain camp soap. I don't even know what camp soap is. I think it's just a
Yeah.
marketing thing, because it's in this small bottle, basically, that you could take it camping. And we did bring it on our camper van trip, but I sort of viewed it just as regular soap. And I've tried to do a little bit of research into this, because the way I think about it is exactly like what you just said. So if you think about the term biodegradable, so it means that it's going to naturally break down on its own. So soap, whether it's clean or toxic, like a chemical soap, the way the substance of soap, it's going to go in the water and then it's just going to go through the pipes and eventually end up wherever that ends up. I worked with a company, a skincare company, and we were talking about the claim biodegradability. And I said to them, like, other companies that make this claim, like it was sunscreen. And so I was like, are the other companies that make this claim about biodegradability, like, are they talking about the packaging or are they talking about the actual sunscreen? And they said, like, they're talking about the sunscreen, but that, like, there's no way to truly test that, right? And so, like, sunscreen's different because you're in natural bodies of water and we don't need to go into that. But let's say like shampoo, for example, right? Like it's going to go through the pipes and end up in the same place, but there's not really a way to test like how that breaks down. And it's more so about the chemicals going into our natural system wherever it ends up. So I tend to look for more about the actual natural ingredients versus biodegradable, because I just haven't seen anywhere, and I've been trying to research this ever since I found that soap, that like I just don't think that there's any validity to biodegradable soap. Meaning, I think all soap breaks down on its own. And the consequence of clean versus chemical products, whether it be soap, shampoo, whatever it is, the consequence is those chemicals ending up in our environment, but I don't think that they break down. I think it's confusing on purpose, which is so sad. I think it's trying to confuse the consumer so much that they just say, well, this must be better and I just will buy this biodegradable soap.
Yeah.
You know?
Yes. Yeah. That is it. Yeah. I felt the same way because in my mind, I learned from a brand, and maybe it was the same one because it was also a sunscreen brand, that they said in order for a brand to claim that it has a biodegradable product, it's only 60% of the product has to be biodegradable, which is not even truly biodegradable because there's still another 40% of something that just sits around, you know?
Right.
And so I guess in that sense, it almost makes me think like, wouldn't it be better to go for natural products? So for like a household cleaner, for example, using vinegar and like isopropyl alcohol. I always have trouble saying isopropyl.
Same.
It would make me think that you should probably pick the more natural ingredients, but I don't know. Sounds interesting. Maybe we'll have to do another podcast on that and have somebody on who knows a little bit more about biodegradability when it comes to ingredients of certain products, because I find that so fascinating. Like there's got to be more research out there, but maybe you're right. Maybe it's just a greenwashing kind of marketing thing to make you think it's better than it actually is. Well, I guess all this to say that biodegradability and composting are not the same thing, even though they are typically used pretty interchangeably.
Yeah. And we are on a mission to change that.
Yes. Oh my gosh. I love this so much. Okay. Going back to composting, do you have any advice for someone who wants to get involved with more composting?
Definitely. So I would say keep an eye out for my composting masterclass. I'm so excited to teach everyone and anyone just the basics of composting, the different types, what actually can go in it. But if you want to get started before that, I would say just grab a bin, like a Tupperware container that you can fit in your fridge, and start with just, let's say when you're cutting up a salad and you have a few of those end bits, just that goes in there. Start with a few habit changes like that. The first things I did were something like that with salad, my coffee grounds, and then I slowly built on that. And like we mentioned earlier, just Google where you live and to find either a pickup or a drop off. And those would be my two first steps of just keeping it simple. And then you can always build on it, learn more. But you're only adding to a habit that you've built. And when you're building this habit of composting from the start, of changing the behavioral shift, you want to keep it as simple as possible.
I think that's great advice. I'm going to have to start doing that myself too, because I've done the beginning stages and now I'm like, ooh, maybe I should get one of those little spinny ones you were talking about that you actually have in the backyard. Maybe I should upgrade my composting.
Yeah. It takes a lot more. It makes it a lot easier to be able to just tumble it as opposed to like having to mix it yourself.
Yeah. I'll have to call my mom. My mom's a really good gardener composter and be like, please help. What do I do? Or I'll just call you. You know what? I'll just take your composting masterclass. How about that?
Yeah, I would love that.
Amazing. Okay. If anybody wants to find you, please share where they can.
Yes. So I am at Robex on Instagram and TikTok, and that is ROBECS. And I am so excited to see you there. And if you have any other composting questions, please always feel free to reach out and keep an eye out for my composting masterclass that I am in the middle of creating.
Oh, so exciting. Oh, amazing. Well, thank you so much, Rebecca, for being on. I feel like I learned so much, and I hope people listening are learning a lot, just like I did in this episode. And if they have any questions, they can always reach out to me if you have a question for me or you. You're probably the better person to ask, let's be honest.
I've loved this. I love the conversation. I could talk for so long about composting, but I'm so thrilled to have been invited on.
Yeah, wonderful, wonderful. Okay, we have made it to good climate news. Today's article is titled "The Eco-Friendly Glass That's Hard to Crack." And it's a very interesting article. As always, I will link it in the show notes below. But basically, this glass is called Lion Glass, or the company's name is Lion Glass. And when you think of regular glass, it's very heavy, it's easy to break. Well, this company was able to create a sort of glass, looks and acts the same way, but it uses not the same materials, so less carbon emissions, and also you can make it at a much lower temperature, which is also great for the environment. It's an interesting article to think about because they talk about how if the company continues on the path that it's going down, that this type of glass is going to become way more popular, and we're going to start seeing it more places, and that's a climate win, if you ask me. I think in the article, though, I also found this interesting that the type of glass that you use on electronics, so like TVs, phones, and like our computers and things like that, is a different type of glass. It has to have different properties. So this glass doesn't necessarily work for our electronics. This is more for like your windows in your house or your cars. Very fascinating, very interesting. Not something I gave much thought to before I saw this article, but going to include it for you guys because it's interesting. That is all for today's episode. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. As always, you can find the podcast on Instagram at Mind Body Planet Podcast, and you can find me, Crystalline, at Crystalline Geyer on all social media platforms. We have a newsletter that is going to be going out on September 1st, so you're going to miss that one by the time this episode gets live, but it's not too late. You can get the next one. And you can find that in the link in the show notes. You can also go to my socials. It's linked in pretty much everything, but it's in the show notes for anybody who is interested in joining the newsletter. It's just once a month, gives you like happy, warm hug type vibes. It's good climate news, health and wellness tips, things like that. And that's all I have for you guys today. So with that, see you next week. Bye.